The 2026 Leon Panetta Lecture Series. The 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. What will be its legacy in the 21st century? This lecture discusses the legacy of free and fair elections, strong check and balance, or constitutional right in trouble. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sylvia Panetta.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the last event of the 2026 Leon Panetta Lecture Series, and it's going to be a wonderful evening. Thank you for being here. As always, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Leon Panetta Lecture Series, coming to you from Leon's hometown of Monterey and the beautiful Monterey Conference Center. We're grateful, as ever, for the continued support of this community. As you can see by the size of tonight's audience, we're a community that recognizes the importance of discourse and dialogue and an appreciation for considered conversation. Tonight concludes this year's series where we have considered the theme, the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, what will be its legacy in the 21st century? We've reflected on the enduring principles that shape this nation, representative government, checks and balances, and the rule of law, and how these principles are being tested today. This evening, we turn to perhaps the most fundamental question facing any democracy. Can Americans continue to trust the integrity of their elections? What is the legacy of free and fair elections? Are they a strong check and balance? Or are they a constitutional right in trouble? The right to vote is the foundation of self-government. Yet, throughout American history, that right has often been contested, restricted, and expanded. And yet, it has always resulted in the peaceful transfer of power. Today, the debate over elections has now become a growing concern about whether the public's trust in elections can be protected from political polarization, misinformation, redistricting, and voter intimidation. We are now only months away from the midterm elections. Our trust in the integrity of our elections is being tested by how states maintain strong election administration, by whether states can maintain their constitutional control of elections, and whether an election violence of the January 6th attacks on the Capitol can be prevented. It is critical that we protect the resiliency of our democratic institutions and enforce the Constitution. How do we restore confidence in our elections? How can we protect this essential element of our democracy and ensure that the right to vote is protected for every American? And in a moment of deep division, can we preserve the public faith necessary for our democracy to function as the founders had intended? Leon will pose these questions to leading political experts from both parties who have first-hand knowledge of campaigns, elections, and their consequences. Our first guest is the former mayor of Chicago, former member of Congress, former ambassador to Japan, and former White House Chief of Staff for President Obama. He has a wealth of experience in city, national, international, and party politics. He was elected 4 times as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from Illinois' 5th Congressional District. As chairman of the House Democratic Caucus, he helped pass legislation to raise the minimum wage. From 1993 to 1998, he was a key member of President Bill Clinton's administration, rising to serve as senior advisor to the President for Policy and Politics. In November 2008, he was named Chief of Staff for President Barack Obama and helped the administration secure the passage of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2099 and the landmark Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. He served as the 55th mayor of the city of Chicago, a position he held until May 2019. On December 18, 2021, he was confirmed by bipartisan vote to serve as the 31st United States Ambassador to Japan. Please welcome Ambassador Rahm Emanuel. Our next guest is a lawyer, law professor, and broadcast journalist whose nationally syndicated radio show is heard in more than 120 cities across the United States every weekday afternoon. He served for nearly 6 years in the Reagan administration in a variety of posts, including assistant counsel in the White House and special assistant to 2 attorneys general, and Deputy Director and General Counsel of the Office of Personnel Management. Today, his radio show has an audience estimated at more than 2 million listeners every week. Since its debut in July of 2000, he has conducted interviews with government officials from both parties and widely respected analysts, authors, and pundits. He is the author of a dozen books, including 2 New York Times bestsellers, and writes daily for his blog, HughHewitt.com, which is among the most visited political blogs in the United States. Please welcome Hugh Hewitt. Our third guest served as senior advisor to President George W. Bush from 2000 to 2007 and deputy chief of staff from 2004 to 2007. At the White House, he oversaw the offices of strategic initiatives, political affairs, public liaison, and intergovernmental affairs, and was deputy chief of staff for policy, coordinating the White House policy-making process. He was the architect of President George W. Bush's 2000 and 2004 White House victories. Before the White House, he ran a public affairs firm that consulted on over 75 GOP campaigns for senator, governor, Congress, and statewide offices in 24 states. Washington Post Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter David Perotter described him as a master political strategist whose game has always been long-term, and he plays it with an intensity and attention to detail that few can match. Please welcome Karl Rove. Our fourth and final guest represented Northeast Ohio's 13th congressional district in the United States Congress for 20 years. He began his career in politics as a congressional aide with Ohio Congressman Jim Traficant and was a state representative in Ohio from 2000 to 2002. He was first elected to Congress in 2003 and served on the House Appropriations Committee, the Budget Committee, and the Defense Subcommittee on Military Construction Veterans Affairs, and as well as related agencies. He's largely credited with leading the economic transformation of Northeast Ohio after years of disinvestment and neglect. He ran for the Democratic nomination for president in 2020 and for the United States Senate in 2022, a race he eventually lost to J.D. Vance in the general election. In 2023, he launched the national advocacy group, quote, called We the People, which is aimed at organizing voters who feel exhausted by partisan politics. Please welcome Tim Ryan. Moderating our discussion is the man who created this lecture series, former United States Representative for this district and the former Director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense. He is also a former White House Chief of Staff, former Director of the Office of Management and Budget and Director of the Office for Civil Rights. He has a lot of experience in elections, White House politics, and the importance of protecting our democracy for the next generation. Please welcome Secretary Leon Panetta.
Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, to this, our final lecture of the 2026 Panetta Lecture Series. Our theme is the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution and its legacy in the 21st century. We've discussed lessons of history, the economy, foreign policy, and tonight, we focus on the most important check in our democracy, the right of we the people to vote in free and fair elections. The Constitution, Article 1, Section 4, makes clear, and I quote, "The times, places, and manner of holding elections shall be prescribed in each state," unquote. Madison said the right to vote is fundamental to our Republican government. And John Adams said it's the very ground of our liberties. The U.S. has maintained the world's longest uninterrupted tradition of national elections and the peaceful transfer of power. Thanks to countless election administrators, volunteers, bipartisan state officials, the courts, American elections have largely been secure, decentralized, and legitimate. That changed with the 2020 election. There was an election denial, partisan polarization, conspiracy theories, a lot of litigation. The courts in over 60 cases rejected the claims, and bipartisan state officials certified the election results. We also had the Electoral College confirm the election. And yet there are continuing election denials. There are threats to election workers. There are federal executive orders to control the right to elections. A lot of that has shaken the public trust in our election system. How do we restore that trust? How do we get back to losers accepting defeat, allowing for the peaceful transfer of power? These are tough questions, but we have a bipartisan, distinguished panel of speakers, all familiar with politics and elections. Let me begin, as I usually do, by addressing the headlines in the news, if I could, particularly with the war in Iran and its impact on the midterm elections. Both Iran and the United States are obviously struggling to see if they can find a way to end this war. It's not being very successful at this point. Iran has closed the Straits of Hormuz, cutting off 20% of the oil supply to the world. We've had high gas prices, increased inflation, affordability concerns. Over 70% of Americans oppose the war. Republicans are concerned, obviously, about the midterms. Iran believes that the midterms put pressure on Trump to end the war. Trump, on the other hand, has said he does not care about the midterms. So the question is, how much of an impact will the Iran war have on the midterm elections, particularly if there is no agreement to end the war? Ron?
Well, first of all, I worked with Leon for 30 years. I made him what he is today. And I just want to say that. He would be nothing if it wasn't for me yelling at him every morning. No. So let me, so I think, first of all, I think the Iran war, when you add it up with other things the president's done on foreign policy, the American people are angry that he's not focused on what they thought they elected him to do, which is to take care of the United States, take care of the cost of living for them, the fact that their kids are going to college. When they graduate, they got $30,000 of debt and they're living in the basement. And they see this as a total distraction, and he's allowed himself to get distracted. And I also believe that if there is an agreement or some type of kind of continuation of a ceasefire, he doesn't get any credit because they don't think this was a good thing to do. So I think it will have the whole war, regardless of how it ends, will have a negative impact because people will see once again, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's him doing what he's doing with Greenland, et cetera, distracted from what they thought he should get done. Democrats, in my view, are angry with what he does and that he gets away with it. Independents are disappointed because they said they made a Faustian bargain and they got all the Faustian piece of that, which is none of the economics and all the personality. And Republicans are angry also that he hasn't, basically they are disappointed and less than angry where the Democrats are, but they feel like they've been had. And so that's where I think the election is, and I think it will have a consequence compiled by other things that reinforce the same basic thing.
Okay, Hugh?
Let me begin by thanking you, Secretary Panetta, for having me. There are very few people in the country with the Secretary's record of public service, and I can count them on one hand. Robert Gates and Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld, honored to be on the stage. Unfortunately, at a time when I'm a Republican, I'm sitting between the ambassador and the architect. Tim Ryan and I are from Warren, Ohio. We're just a couple of kids from northeastern Ohio, so what are we doing here?
Same question we had.
I was warned. There are tidal charts in American politics. The tide is going to go out on the Republicans in 5 months. Went out on President Bush in 2006. And so I'm glad he's not caring about the midterms. He has to win the war. I don't want a deal. I don't want anything other than a capitulation on the nuclear materials and on freedom for the people of Iran and a few other things. And you're the Secretary of Defense, you're the ambassador, the other are more. I want a win over Iran. It will be worth it if we win it, and it will pay off in 2028 and the president's historical standing. If he loses it, it's a disaster, not just for the party, but for the country and for the region. So the only way through it is to win it.
Carl?
Well, first of all, I want to join and thank you for having us here today. I noticed, although we got a peck in the cheek from the woman who introduced us, but you got kissed full on the lips. and I'm delighted to be here with the shy, retiring Rahm Emanuel and my longtime friend, the voice of Southern California. Look, first of all, 5 months in this environment in which we live, where things seem to happen very rapidly, it's going to be hard to forecast how this turns out great, but it may not turn out bad. For example, what happens if the strait reopens and there is some kind of an agreement and oil prices come down? Then people may say, the advocates of Trump may then say, he was a strong leader and he took action, and we are in a polarized society. And his supporters are going to be looking for reasons to say, I'm glad he did what he did. But this is a weird environment, and how the campaigns are conducted and how the war comes to where it is in September and October is going to have a huge impact. Remember, this is being fought out, the political battle is being fought out over the following circumstances. The president's approval ratings are low. The Republican Party is slightly less popular than him. And the Democratic Party is less popular than both of them. So, it's not like we have, yes, there is anger among the Democrat base, but the Democrats are divided and polarized, and the Republicans have got to get themselves energized. And the way to energize is not to simply sit on the laurels and say, re-elect us to the control of Congress because of the great job we've done. It's they've got to go out and say, we got in a mess because of what the previous administration did. Here are the things that we have done and the things we want to do to get us out of that and go on the offense.
Tim?
Yeah, I think, where Hugh mentioned we grew up in the same town, older industrial area, halfway between Cleveland and Pittsburgh. We're both Catholic school boys, Warren John F. Kennedy High School. And in those areas, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, this is economics to them, to the voters. This is about gasoline prices. And the inflation thread is now tied to the international relations thread, which is tied directly to, how much they got to pull out of their wallet to try to drive to the job site. Summer's here. We all know how gas prices affect, people's summer travel. So I think it's an economic issue, and I think it's going to hurt them. And then I do a lot of stuff with young men, 18 to 30, as a voting group. And these young men who went with Trump, they were turned off from the Democrats, they went to Trump, they are now turning on Trump. Absolutely, whether it's some of the glyphosate, healthy food stuff, or the war in Iran. And so I think you've got an economic argument wrapped into the Iranian situation, and it's the guy who said we shouldn't get in any foreign wars, and he makes an insane decision, in my humble opinion, to start a war in the middle of the oil-producing countries. And so I think it's going to be one of the things that they'll tie to him, Democrats will tie to him, I hope, that can shift the election.
Okay, let me move on to something else that's in the news. The president has had 3 what are called revenge primaries in Louisiana, Kentucky, and recently Texas, with the Paxson win over Cronin. He clearly supports loyalty over capability and experience, and he's been very successful in the primaries. But how much of a threat does this pose for Republicans in the general election? Carl, you had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that pointed out 5 Paxton problems in the general election. What do you think is going to happen in Texas?
We're going to have a horse race, which is unusual because the last time the Democrats won a statewide race in Texas was in 1994. So it's going to be a horse race because our candidate is scandal plagued. He was impeached by a Republican State House of Representatives over charges of corruption and bribery and misuse of power and misuse of government funds. And he's got to have an answer for those. On the other hand, the Democrat is, look, I live in Austin, Texas. It's sort of like Moscow on the Little Colorado River. I mean, it's a little blueberry in the middle of a deep Red Sea. And so you say weird things if you're a Democrat in Austin, like we have 6 genders, and God is non-binary, and my campaign is officially vegan. And we've got to reduce, it's an existential question that we reduce our consumption of beef. I mean, let me just tell you, they don't like that out in Comanche. This is going to be, the question is going to be how much money are the Democrats going to invest in it? How good is their candidate going to be in articulating a a message that appeals to moderate and moderately conservative Texans, some of whom vote Republican. But let's step back for just a minute. There's something bigger here, which is the president is creating a problem for himself. Because, look, you cannot simply say to members of any party, Democrat or Republican, you have to vote with me 100% of the time or there's going to be a price to be paid. And by backing Paxton over Cornyn, who is a longtime respected member of the Senate, it's caused lots of members of the Congress, particularly in the Senate, to say, you know what? It doesn't matter if I'm 100% loyal. If you know, Trump said I'm endorsing Paxton because Cornyn didn't say nice things fast enough for me when I ran for re-election in 2024. So you're going to have people, and as Ram and you can say, and Tim can say, from experience, there are lots of ways that members of Congress can make life hell for the White House. And when you have Tillis and Cassidy and Cornyn, who all are basically victims of retribution, and then Murkowski and Collins and Curtis, who are basically, I'm beholden to the people in my state. You got 6 Republicans and probably more. That's why the very stupid idea of $1.776 billion to pay off felons who attacked the police on January 6th. That's what. Let me finish.
I just want to say this. I think we should actually have this covered by Blue Cross Blue Shield. I think this is good mental health for you.
Yeah. You know, that's why it's dead. And there are going to be consequences for the president. You know, I saw Chuck Grassley come out and say, this is a stupid idea. I mean, you know, it's dead. There's no way in hell he's going to get it. And it's been emboldened by people saying to themselves, you know what? Did I come here just to do what he tells me to do, or did I come here to do what I think is best for my state or my district?
So what do you think about the anti-weaponization fund that was about $1.8 billion to pay off?
No need to exaggerate. It's $1.776 billion.
So, I mean, I think, first of all, it doesn't pass the smell test. It didn't need a lot of description. People saw it and saw exactly what it was. First of all, you totally pilfer the capital. Then you pay a price by going to jail. Then you get a pardon, and now we're going to pay you. And people realize that all that didn't work. Now I want to go back to your first question because I think this is a referendum election. It's about Donald Trump and the Republicans. If you go through 1994, 2006, 2010, 2018, there is a law of physics that kicks in. Energized party out of power voters, Democrats are now 14 for 14 in statewide elections. Independents break 2-1 for the party out of power. We have seen that. We are 26 for 26 in flipping state legislative seats, haven't lost a single one. And Republicans are depressed. And the more he does exactly what Carl said, which is penalize Republicans, that is going to take the 10 or 12% of the Republicans to either sit out or vote against. You have a referendum election on the stewardship. The president's at historic lows, the party's at historic lows, and the mood of the country is, and also economic. This is going to be not a vote for Democrats, but a vote against Donald Trump and the supplicant Republicans. And it's going to, Carl, stop doing that. It's going to come.
You'd know if I did.
Okay.
You'd really know.
Actually, that gives a whole new meaning to the invisible hand of the market. So this is going to come down, and they're going to get a whack, and it's going to be in the historic proportion in that ever. And this just reinforces people's image of the president. He keeps. This is what is weird. Usually, a president starts to either dial back or dial center. This president is dialing up all the things that people don't like about him. He is like going out of his way as it relates to the Republicans and trying to make their life miserable. It's weird, and I don't want him to stop.
Q? Well, someone's got to say something good about the Republicans, so I'm going to do that. I saw the invitation. The good news is you're invited by Secretary Panetta. The bad news is that Ambassador Emanuel's sitting next to you, so I went and watched him with Glenn Youngkin, which I would recommend to all of you, so I got to keep my arm turned just in case. there are going to be so many stories between now and the election. For example, if Justice Alito retires, as I expect, and nobody else does, and you get a nominee, the party on my right here will not be able to stop themselves from doing what they've done to every one of our nominees, and the page will change and the chapter will turn, and we'll have a new theme. So I'm not writing off the Senate, I'm not writing off the president, and I just think the House is very, very difficult to hold on to. And I don't worry about the judgment fund. There's a judge, I was at judgment at Justice, and we had a judgment fund. So it's a bad idea, but it's not Achilles' heel. It's not fatal. It's not the end of the world. And no one will remember it in a week.
And give him an A for effort. That was so beautiful. That was so special.
Tim, you got anything to say about
I knew it.
The one race that really stood out to me was the Massey race down in Kentucky, because there's a rift coming. Ron mentioned it, but there's a rift coming with a lot of independent voters. And when you look at the Make America Healthy movement again, it's falling into two categories. And the vaccination piece is really dialed down at this point, and the food piece is coming front and center. And one of the things Trump did was he signed the Defense Production Act to increase production of glyphosate, which is what you put on a lot of the industrial ag. And the cancer rates in Iowa are the highest they're growing more rapidly than anywhere else in the country. And there's some interesting races in Iowa. But I say this because the glyphosate issue, approving dicamba, gutting the EPA, increasing production of coal. There are a lot of Maha moms who used to be Democrat, went independent, didn't think they had a home, went to Kennedy on the food piece. Kennedy went with Trump, they went with Trump. Now they are absolutely up for grabs. So you add on that issue where it's a finger in your eye, like we put Kennedy on, we're gonna do the food thing, and then you start going down the list of things that they really, really care about, and Trump has absolutely betrayed them. And so that's a whole other block. And so not only did he do that, the top Republican in Congress that was supporting the Maha movement was Thomas Massey. He picked a candidate, put $80 million behind them, and beat Massey in a primary. So not only did he do the legislative stuff, the executive order stuff, he also targeted their top person. And so you have a whole other group of people that are absolutely betrayed by this, and I think that's going to flop into the.
I got to dissent.
Flop into the mix.
I got to dissent. Tom Massey was a nightmare for the Republican Party. Nancy Mace is gone. Matt Gaetz is gone. Ralph Norman is gone. Bob Good is gone. The knucklehead caucus that drove Kevin McCarthy, who was made to be Speaker, is almost all gone. So when the president gets rid of Massey, he does the Republican Party a favor. And I'll leave it to the expert.
If I could join in that. Massey, first of all, anti-Israel.
Yes.
A neo-isolationist, and not a team player. In the House, whether you're Democrat or Republican, it's a team sport. So when you set a rule for how a bill is going to be brought up on the floor and how it's going to be discussed, the Democrats, if they're in power, pass a rule and vote in favor of it, and the Republicans vote against it. Republicans are in power, the Republicans are supposed to vote for the rule that governs how they'll bring up a piece of legislation. Massey is a member of the Rules Committee and votes against the Republican rule and votes against him on the floor. His whole object in life was to make himself important by picking, whether it's Jeffrey Epstein or something else, how could he be in opposition to the Republican leadership? And you know, he's a libertarian more than he is a Republican. And it wasn't just Donald Trump. Donald Trump was probably enough to kill Massey, but there were lots of other people who supported Israel, people who supported a strong national defense, people who believed that Republicans ought to support each other when important legislation is brought forward, people who believed in national security. He's a nut when it comes to things like the ability of the U.S. government to track the efforts of foreign individuals to communicate with their agents inside the United States. So there are lots of reasons that he went down, and not just simply that Donald Trump, somehow didn't like his personality.
Well, I would just say, straight electorally, there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people who identify with that movement, and they saw Trump as targeting one of their top guys. Yeah. I don't disagree. I mean, I was in.
If that was a major issue, they would have talked about the race. I don't think there was a single speech, single ad talking about, Roundup on
Well,
industrial.
I don't think it was in Kentucky, but what I'm saying is in these swing districts where there's a lot of suburban voters who shop at Whole Foods and care about this issue that voted for Trump, I'm telling you, it's going to be an issue.
We'll see how much Democrats try and make it an issue if it is real.
Well, that's the whole other conversation, Carl.
No,
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say they're talking two different things. I can't believe I feel like I'm being the middle child here. But so one is, there is no doubt when you take a look at what the president's done in the Texas Senate primary or Louisiana, and then you take a look at what Tim's saying, the coalition that elected him is breaking apart. And the real, forget Massey, whatever, et cetera, but the real thing is if you look what the coalition that elected him, and he expanded ranks of the Republican Party, African-American young men, quote-unquote Maha mothers, et cetera, you go through that, Hispanic voters, you can see it in the new map in Texas. I think Democrats are going to do well under that map because Hispanic voters that went for Trump are now going to come back to the Democratic Party. That coalition is broken, and it's broken, and I don't think it can get repaired. The question for us as Democrats is which of that element can you now seize and bring it back into the bosom of the party and continue to derive divisions in the within the Republican Party. And there is an opening because of Trump's demanding of 100%, not 99%, 100% loyalty, doing things that make him wealthier and stupid things, in my view, like this fund that only reinforce the opportunity for pieces of his coalition to be broken off, be unanchored, and those are windows of opportunity for the Democrats. I don't think we're, as a party, capable of seizing that, but I think that's our windows of opportunity, and I think that's what's really important in this discussion.
Can I pick up on something?
Do not applaud for us being incapable, but that's what's happening. Yeah, I got that, Carl. I'm not even going to look over there for that. But you would agree with that. You would agree.
I want to follow up on something. I think you made a really important point. Both parties have unstable coalitions.
Yes.
But I would say that the instability of the Trump coalition, one of the problems is he doesn't understand the instability of it. Yeah. How did he get elected? 35% of the electorate, 36, 34, said, we love the guy. We love the fact that he gives the middle finger to political norms. We like what he did in his first term. We just love the guy. Everything he says and does, we're for. 13 or 14% of the electorate, which got him to 49, said, we really don't like the guy. He's not a good role model for our kids and grandkids.
Exactly.
But things were better when he was in office, and we cannot stand 4 more years of what we've just gone through. And if he understood that he had that electorate, then he would be conducting himself in a different way. Yes, he'd be doing things that would keep that 35 or 36%, but he would find ways to not make it all about himself and all about me, me, me. I'm the greatest president there's ever been. I've got it. The ballroom's going to be wonderful. George Washington wanted the ballroom even before he lived in the White House. So, he wouldn't be doing that stuff. Yeah. Don't encourage me, please.
Let me ask about the election system. A healthy election system requires access, verification, security, and trust, both majority rule and minority protection. But most of all, it requires acceptance of the results, that you have winners and losers. Every president ultimately accepted the legitimacy of the outcome and facilitated a peaceful transfer of power. But in 2010, despite certified results and little evidence to the contrary, the president denied the election results. Has election denial now become a major force in American politics? And how can the election process survive if losing parties refuse to accept the outcomes?
Well, I'll start by just adding a little history. In 1960, Richard Nixon won the election, but a previous mayor of Chicago and a senator from Texas assured that he did not win the election. Richard Nixon conceded rather than contest. Go forward to the year 2000, 40 years later, and George W. Bush wins the election, Al Gore concedes, and then calls back to retract the concession, and we have Florida, which is the beginning of the breakup, the crack-up that we have had. He was challenged in 2004. Carl knows the statistics. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court got involved in taking an election in 2018. It is a fraying of the common tapestry of we give up on election night and we declare a winner. I don't know a way out of it, but it got started in 2000. I just want to make sure that all the bodies are on the table when we start doing the autopsy.
Did you ever see Pat Buchanan was on Scarborough one morning and they were talking about the 1960 election?
No.
So Buchanan saying, or Scarborough saying, hey, they stole votes in Chicago, and and Scarborough's laying the case out, and he looks at Buchanan and he says, why didn't you guys file an appeal? Like he stole Illinois. Why didn't you file? And Pat Buchanan goes, because we stole Kentucky.
Never heard that.
So everybody
Different
does
time.
it. Let me ask about redistricting, because,
Can I
go
say
ahead,
something?
Rob.
A lot of the discussion about the instability of our democracy, the answers are, same-day voting, mail-in balloting, et cetera. If you really look at the last 20, 30 years, the moment the American dream becomes unaffordable is exactly the time in which our democracy becomes unstable. And the more and more that the American dream gets out of reach, college costs, owning a home, first-time home, healthcare. So while a lot of people's ideas of fixing democracy, and there is a piece of just democratic norms and staying consistent with them, are true, I think the best kind of medication towards the democratic process is restoring confidence that people have access to the American dream. And the moment that became unaffordable, our politics start to get unwound and faster. So it's the economics and the politics, and basically the basic contract between the American people and their government got broken, and people feel like the political system took care of itself and left them holding the bag. So restore the American dream and accessibility, and you'll see a politically stable democracy.
Yeah, good point. Let me ask about redistricting and this kind of race to the bottom. Redistricting normally takes place every 10 years with the census. Now it's become kind of a free-for-all in both parties. Began in Texas, California, Virginia, others. Will redistricting make any difference in the final results? Is it going to make a difference? And are we now going to have redistricting in every election? Or can we restore fair representation? Or is the genie out of the bottle? Carl?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's hard to, and the Republicans will gain an advantage of it, from this redistricting. When I looked at the numbers, though, it was relatively modest, and there's a trade-off. The number of solid Republican seats grows, that is, the seats that basically all the prognosticators would say are going to be Republican or are going to be Democrat. The number of both of those seats, Republicans gain more solid Republican seats than Democrats gain solid seats. But the number of seats which lean some direction increase. The number of seats that are absolute toss-ups remains roughly the same, but each side is slightly more at risk in the seats that we say lean, or better than that, likely, but the lean seats. And there the Republicans have gained more lean seats than the Democrats, meaning that if this is the wave election that Ron was talking about, then the difference is going to be the Republicans gain 4 or 5 seats by the number of solid seats they created, but they put at risk 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 seats from the seats that are now lean, not likely or solid. And then it gets settled by who wins the majority of the roughly 20 some odd seats that are totally toss-ups. And this is why, again, the politics of this are difficult for the incumbent party. There have only been 3 instances in the last 100 years in which the White House party gained seats. We don't have polling data for 1934, but FDR inarguably was very popular. 1998, the month before the 98 election, Clinton's approval rating was 63%. and 2002 Bush's was 61. I happened to be at the White House and involved a little bit in that. And let me tell you, it wasn't easy even with 61. So the Republicans with a 3-seat majority, can be damn hard for them to keep the House with a president with a approval rating between 39 and 41.
Yeah.
Can I, Leon?
Well,
Look, I mean, as a reformed redistrictor, I mean, we all practice, Carl and I, we practice the dark arts of redistricting here. I'm not going to come up here as some reformer. But I will come up here as a former ambassador to Japan on this. While we're arguing about redistricting, China's doubling their research budget. In life sciences, robotics, quantum computing. While we're arguing about a ballroom, they're building ballistic missiles. And while we're looking at how high the arch is going to be, they're doubling their resources in AI. We are totally distracted, and I'll add to that, 50% of our kids can't read at grade level. And nobody is, so I have practiced the politics of redistricting. We've done it, we've thought about it, we put it aside, and then for the next 10 years, you try to figure out how to solve the country's problems. Now, I've done that politics, but I'm telling you, we are distracted from the biggest game in town, which is we are, for the first time in our history, you said 250-year anniversary, this is the first time we've faced a country that's 3 times our size. Now, I'm open to the discussion of how we get from here to there with 50% of our kids reading at grade level and the other 50% not. We have never faced a country this size with this purpose to bury us. And we are totally distracted from the things that we need to be focused on because we're arguing with each other about redistricting, about $1.78 billion for a restitution fund, about a ballroom, an arch, and it has nothing to do with the future of this country that he is responsible for.
all right, let me...
Although I am for redistricting. I just want to be clear about that.
We've come to the half point of the program, and we're going to be turning to the questions from the audience. I'd like to take a moment to recognize our question review team. These are the people who select the questions that will be presented to our speakers, and so I ask you to hold your applause until I introduce the entire group. We've got Mike Clancy, who's with KSQD FM 90.7, David Kellogg, who's a managing editor of the Monterey Herald, Doug McKnight, who's a reporter with KAZU Radio, and Pete Waversky, who is managing editor of the opinion page of the San Francisco Chronicle. Would you please give them a hand? And thank you.
Have them stand up so we can find the sons of bitches.
Sylvia and I want to thank the Panetta Institute Board of Directors and our lecture series sponsors that make these programs all possible and allow us to have these important discussions. Not just with all of you, but with our audience watching at home and with students from across the Central and Northern California area. This has been a tremendous season, and we are so thankful that we're able to continue this important work. Would you please give our sponsors a hand? Let me, before I turn to the questions, let me just ask the Democrats about the concern about Democrats, and I'll do the same with the Republicans. While the polls continue to show that Trump and Republicans are in trouble in the midterms, and you've all pretty much said that, Democrats are still beating themselves up with Biden and Harris and the failure to deal with inflation, immigration, cultural elitism. What do Democrats have to do to present a clearer message and vision to the voters? Tim?
I think the Democrat, you have to, like in sports, you'd say next play mentality. You make a mistake, next play, don't worry about the last play. We've got a next play mentality, this thing. And I think the frame that we need to be in, obviously this is about Trump. Like this election's gonna be about Trump, we're the opposition, that's kind of where we're gonna live. But that's not gonna carry us through the next 3 years. And I would like to see, just as a constituent, the party grab the mantle of reform. Everything needs reformed. everything is broken. Like every system that we have, and Ram just touched upon this, every system we have is broken. Immigration reform's broken, the economic system's broken, the education system's broken, the healthcare system's broken, our debt and deficit is outrageous. Like Democrats need to lean in on the debt, $40 trillion in debt. It's now bigger than the defense budget every year, just paying the interest on the debt. So I want the Democratic Party to look a lot like Bill Clinton in 1992, where we're talking about reinventing government, using AI instead of just being scared about it. Do we need guardrails? Yes. Legal regime? Yes. But the transformational effects for AI in healthcare will blow your mind. Transformational effects of AI with education on getting kids up to the reading levels they need to be at. There's a really cool school called the Alpha School that for 2 hours a day, they teach kids how to move on AI and use AI, and they're 5x test scores against the average public school. And they've figured out the rest of the day to teach them life skills and public speaking and nutrition and all these other things. So the point is, Democrats have to completely rebrand. The brand is so toxic in so many areas of this country. I don't know if it is in Monterey or not, but this is much different than any place I usually hang out in. I'm going to be in Leon's basement for the next week, just hanging out here in Monterey. But we have to find some big, bold rebrand that is actually rooted in policies. And that's why, you know, I serve with Ram, but Ram always has something that he has to say about how we're going to do it. And I think, Ram, that's a very important contribution to the Democratic Party right now. Not to just say you hate Trump or this is wrong, but what are we going to do to address some of these huge structural institutional problems? And if we don't do that, then we're going to be in a bad way, I think, in 28.
So, Ron, look, both parties have had, the country has had two presidents that have tried to restore a past that's not coming back. If you look at Build Back Better, or MAGA, it's about a restoration, and it's basically driving 55 miles an hour around wet pavement going forward by trying to restore a past that ain't coming back. 2028 for the country will be the first election about the future. We haven't really had one in about 20 years. And I think the Democratic Party, grabbing on what Tim said, should be about painting what that future is and the ability to get that future done. The second component, the lesson with Kennedy, Clinton, and Obama. Obama had to make a point on Father Wright, his own pastor, and he did it with a speech, and he was very clear, so the rest of the message got heard. Under Clinton, it became what's shorthanded as Sister Souljah, but he went to Operation Push to give a speech about a rap star who was saying things about white people and racially, and did it at Operation Push. Kennedy goes down in 1960 to Texas and says, I will not be a Catholic president. I will be a president who is Catholic. And he gives a very, very important speech. Both of them, all three candidates, normalize themselves on what I call the cultural norm. We did not do that in 2024. We looked like, basically, we got ourselves caught. We declared cultural wars in our schools, and we lost. When we finally opened up schools after COVID, and our biggest debate isn't classrooms, but bathrooms. We decided that bathroom access was more important than classroom excellence. And the people voted on that. And so to me, normalize yourself, which is not that hard, as I like to say jokingly. We weren't really good at the kitchen table. We weren't good in the family room. The only room we occupied was the bathroom, and it's the smallest room in the house. Okay? So normalize yourself. Talk about the future, and a future that is inclusive of people, of where they want their children to be. And it will be the first election in 20 years, and the countries do this, that is about the future, and we should be the first to define it and what it means.
So let me ask the let me ask the Republicans about the concerns about where the Republicans are going. Trump says he doesn't care about the midterms. You know, it's clear that the war in Iran is impacting on the price of gas, inflation, cost of living, the kinds of things that Republicans usually focus on in terms of trying to improve people's lives. Even on immigration enforcement, There's been a lot of loss of support because of the way that was conducted. What do Republicans have to do to improve their chances in the election? Do they have to move away from Trump? Are they going to move towards more establishment republicanism? Where's the party going? Hugh?
Well, President Nixon used to say, and I worked for him a long time ago, 1978 to 80, that you couldn't win with just the Goldwater Republicans, but you couldn't win without them. So Republicans cannot win without the Trump Republicans, but we need more than that. The reason, as a Republican, the ambassador scares me as a nominee is he got to education first. When Carl was helping President Bush become President Bush, they ran on education. And the One Big Beautiful Bill, or the Working Families Tax Cut, has within it the first national voucher program, because we're going to get to education, and the Republicans can fix education. It's the most important issue that connects every generation that cannot be dealt with by the Democratic Party because they are wholly owned subsidiary of the teachers' unions. And therefore, the Republicans need to grab onto it and speak to exactly what the ambassador said. Our kids are not performing and the schools are not changing fast enough, and we have to free the schools from the teachers' union. That's why I'm not worried about the Republican Party. They have an anti-Semitism problem, and they have an education union problem. So I'm not that worried.
Okay, so first of all, Tim and Ram described what the Republicans must do. Same thing as the Democrats. They've got to articulate a vision for the future, and that has got to be something that affects people in the lives that they're living, where they're living. Which, you know, look, both parties have a problem in describing exactly what these two guys said they need to do for the Democrats, and which I agree we need to do for the Republicans, and that is we have a philosophical divide. Let them, you know, Democratic Socialists versus more traditional Democrats. In our party, it's between populism and traditional conservatism. And there are two problems. One problem is who's going to dominate that argument and win it by 2028. It's very hard, I think, for the populism to continue, because populism is, first of all, based largely in personality. You look at the 1930s, we had two different kinds of populists. One on the left, Huey Long, every man a king, take from them that got to give to them that don't, and Father Coughlin on the right, broadcasting from Detroit every night. The Depression is the result of the Jews and their friends on Wall Street. And what happened was Long died, assassinated, and Coughlin was discredited for personal reasons, and the movement lost support. Well, Trump is a unique figure. Nobody has the talent, the feral ability to figure out where people are and where they might respond. There's nobody like him inside the Republican Party. So the question is, in the 2028 selection of a presidential nominee, how are people going to take populism and try and sell it inside the party? And how are they going to try and take traditional conservative values and views and sell them inside the party and apply them to the new circumstances in which the country finds itself? That's why both parties are going to end up doing this in their own way. Democrats between the Democratic Socialist wing, the more traditional Democratic wing, inside the Republican Party, the populists versus the traditional conservatives. And as a result, it is going to be really interesting and hugely consequential, which means everybody needs to participate in this on the team that you want to be in. There's no sitting here and making it a spectator sport. This is why, look, I don't want to hurt Rom's, you know, standing among the Democrats in the room.
But
I'm thrilled.
Let me do it right now.
I am thrilled he's doing what he's doing, because he is saying on behalf of traditional Democrats, get our act together. And what Hugh and I need to do is, in our party, is say to our members of our party, get your act together, because the future of the country depends upon two strong, viable parties that are fighting for the middle of American politics, not trying to make their ways to the extreme wings, whether it is an ideological wing or a populist wing. That doesn't serve the country over the long haul.
Rob?
Yeah. You know, we get paid sometimes to be really, really smart. This isn't that complicated. No, I mean this. Look, you've had 3 presidential elections where 7 states and 500,000 voters have decided who's president. All 7 states are quote-unquote swing states. Why are they swing states? More swing voters. I keep saying to Democrats, 50% or just shy of 50% of the electorate calls themselves independents. There is no smelling salt you're going to put back in the New Deal coalition pops up the next morning. So we have to find common cause with independents that then see that Democrats are a safer hand than the Republicans. And the next 2 years post the election, both parties, and Carl's right, there's two wings in both parties. They're going to have a thorough, big debate about this, and they're going to decide who to nominate. But in the end of the day, if you look at Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, both elections and re-elections, when our back's against the wall as a party, the most important ideological test is, can you win? That was true for President Obama. That was true for Bill Clinton. It will be true again. But we're going to have a good thrashing, which we haven't had, and we're going to decide who to put forward, and we have to keep our eye on the prize. 7 states, 500,000 voters across the 7 states have decided the president for the last 3 presidential elections. We don't have a room for error.
Okay, first question is along those lines. Who are the likely candidates for the 2028 presidential election?
Let Tim and I answer the Republican part.
In the GOP, is it Vance, Rubio, Pence, other? Is it MAGA versus establishment? And for the Dems, is it Newsom, Kelly, Shapiro, Harris, Rahm, Bashir, Pritzker, left or center? So who's likely to be nominated in 2028 as the presidential candidates for each of your parties? Hugh, let's start with you.
Well, the vice president will have an advantage if he decides to run, but we have a very deep bench and a lot of great talent. Usually a vice president will draw a challenger from the Senate, so someone like Dave McCormick. Mondale drew a challenger in Hart and George H.W. Bush, drew a challenger in Bob Dole. So if a vice president is running, they'll draw a challenger from the Senate. But we have Glenn Youngkin. We got a lot of bench strength. What Carl was talking about is it will be a nasty, if the current president gets involved against someone who is winning, it will be a nasty meltdown because unlike previous presidents, he will stay involved in the party. And so I'm not worried about our talent. I am worried about whether or not it goes sideways because the president doesn't like who the party nominates.
Good point. Carl?
Yeah, I agree with everything he said. I mean, I think the key point is going to be, does Donald Trump say, I get to choose, or does he say, it is better for my party and the country to let the people choose?
Not likely.
Well, the people will get to choose no matter what, but if he puts his thumb on the scale, he'll be less popular than among Republicans than he is today. That's just simply the fact that there is a thing, lame duck, but he could swing it if he wanted to. Reagan, remember, wisely did not try. He was very fond of his vice president, but he said, you know what, our country and my party is going to be better off if he gets to win it on his own. And so he did not endorse him until I think it was September of the election year after the Republican primaries and the Republican convention. But look, here's the other thing. We think this is coming up in like 2.5 years. In politics, that's like 3 geological ages. We got the Jurassic, the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and lots of weird things are going to happen. Remember, as we approach 2024 and 2023, we all thought Ron DeSantis was going to be a fantastic candidate, and he turned out to be a dud. But he was right on both the Democratic side and the Republican side. You met Brian Kemp, a name. Theodore Cruz wants to run again. Tom Cotton would like to run. There are going to be people pop out into this drama that we don't talk about today. Mike Pompeo, who turned out to be able on the campaign trail and capable of grabbing public attention on both sides. Rahm's going to have to fight for it hard. He's off to a good start. I want to be clear. But, this is why this is something, we have to make this something other than a spectator sport. Each of us needs to get involved in this on behalf of someone and some party that we think fits the future and help them win.
Okay, what happens to the Democrats?
Well, unlike the last 3 presidentials where you never really had a choice, 2028 is going to be like Baskin Robbins. You're going to have 31 flavors. I plan on being Rocky Road if I decide to do it, but I mean, but I get back to this. I mean, we didn't have a choice. Actually think it really hurt us not having a choice in 2024. I think Kamala would have been stronger had she fought for it and gotten it. And I think she would have as a sitting vice president, and she would have been a stronger general candidate for that. It didn't happen. 2020, it came down to President Biden versus Bernie Sanders. It wasn't a choice. It was self-evident. It was over. As soon as that became a binary choice, boom. And 2016, that's it. So this is going to be, and the party needs to have this debate. And I say this also for one other reason. We've made this huge mistake post-Obama. President Obama, and I'm as guilty as anybody playing politics in '09, demographics is destiny. We kept repeating that. If you look at Obama's coalition, Democrat, and we became intellectually lazy. We haven't really thought about where we're going to be on education, where we're going to be on technology, et cetera. And the party paid a price. We know 2026 is a referendum election. 2028 is a choice election. And if you want to get the keys to the car, you have to be persuasive of that choice and put your best foot forward. And so the debate about who that nominee is, as much as what that vision is really going to be something the party really has not done in 20 years. And we owe it to the country to have a good thrashing. And I mean that. And we should just get out there and really have a thrashing, have debates, have a discussion, both domestic, international, economic, cultural, family issues, and discuss it and argue it out, because we owe ourselves that, because that is what is going to make us a better party and better representative of the country in this process. But you don't know, and the one thing you do know is that there's always a wild card.
Yeah.
So.
Tim?
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. Like, you just don't know who's going to come out. And we've got governors. I do think the executive experience, whether you're mayor or governor, there's a texture to that. There's a energy to that I think we need about, looking towards the future. But I very much think that a lot of people are going to not look through. I think a lot of people will, but I think there'll be independent voters in 28 who are going to look to through this whole thing through the lens of culture, and they want someone who's going to pop us out of this. Everyone just feels like shit. You know what I mean? It's just like, oh God Almighty, can't go to Thanksgiving dinner. I'm going to fight with everybody about something. I can't talk to them anymore. I avoid them at the basketball game.
That's like every night at our house. I don't know why you think it's just a Thanksgiving. That's every night at our house.
You may be uniquely equipped for this job, Ram, with that. But to take half a step back, like Q was putting this in the context, like this country has been operating in absolute fear, probably since the start of the Kennedy assassination and the assassinations and the Vietnam War and the deindustrialization and the boom and bust of the 80s and the tech boom and then obviously the fentanyl, opiates, suicide rates. I mean, it's just people are operating with a lot of fear, and that fear has led to complete disconnection from each other, from our communities. And I think, and I hope that Democrats, that we nominate somebody who can really speak to that, in a really honest, heartfelt way, because I think when there's so much noise, I hate the word authentic, because everyone uses it. You got to be authentic, but you have to communicate in a very heartfelt way about where we're all at right now, if you want to lead them to the vision that I hope our party portrays. And that is what would cut through. And so I think we have to thrash out the policy stuff for sure, but I hope both parties nominate someone who can do that, because everyone knows we need to come together and figure these huge, huge, huge issues out. And we're not going to do that if we're disconnected.
Okay, this is a question on something that obviously a lot of people think about these days with AI. With the rise of AI, deep fake, and social media, how can the U.S. protect the integrity of its election while still safeguarding free speech? Good question. Hugh?
Well, I would begin by saying it's up to the candidates to, when they take the stage at debates, speak clearly and plainly about what is true and what is not true. It is up to the media to be much more difficult on candidates. I've done 5 GOP presidential debates, and we spend weeks getting ready for them, and they were hard for our candidates. Democrats, basically they had the Washington Generals asking questions. They're people that played against the Globetrotters. The media need to push on Democrats to get what's real and what's not real, because the stuff that's called fake news sometimes is fake and sometimes it's not. So it's up to the candidates to make the sale on that. And it's up to journalists, like Carl's now a journalist, whether he wants to be. Did I slander you there?
I'm a columnist.
Okay, you're a journalist, I'm an analyst journalist. We have to be a whole lot more aggressive on candidates and what is not true when it appears to be not true.
Look, AI is here. It's going to generate more material. It's going to allow people to quickly create ads and so forth. I'm less worried about that than I'm worried about something that's already happening, which is that campaigns are hiring influencers who appear to be, quote, unconnected to the campaign and who can spread the most unbelievable untruths and create in the ecosystem of a campaign, they can create large ripples, and nobody knows that they're being paid by somebody to do that stuff. So I do think, just as if you run a TV ad, if you're a super PAC or a candidate, you have to have your disclaimer on it. Campaigns need to be responsible. If they're paying somebody to influence people through social media posting, we need to know about it, and it needs to be somehow be identifiable as on behalf of that campaign.
Good idea.
Well, and it's got to be enforceable too, because I mean, a lot of times now the FEC, you can get dinged by them, and it's not 10-year. I mean, if they're going to produce content quicker, part of a reform proposal would be you've got to be able to call this stuff out, if not in real time, but real quickly, in order to protect the integrity of what's being communicated.
The checks and balances between the 3 branches of government set up by the Constitution have been severely weakened, with the legislative branch giving up much of its power to the executive. What needs to be done to restore these checks and balances?
Well, the Congress has to show up for its job. I mean, I'm sorry.
That's a good start.
I mean, actually, this is a case study in the brilliance of our founding fathers. They knew the balance between 3 equal branches of government, the way it served, that while it had its own complications and its own kind of pace or not pace, that 3 equal branches of government served the ultimate national interest well. I'm sorry, the supplicants in Congress today that call themselves the Republican Party, who whisper on national security and other things that they disagree with the president but never take the courage to say it, we are paying a price for a branch of the government that basically is mailing it in. And now, my fear is that when I do believe the Democrats are going to win the House in 2026, they will go over the board and not actually work. I'm for investigating corruption. I've been upfront about that, et cetera, because I think the corruption around this administration, financially, et cetera, needs to be aired out. It hasn't been aired out. But we have to do the work, and the not having a branch of government, the legislative branch, and willingly taking a back seat, the country has paid a price for that basically lack of responsibility and accountability for being an equal branch of the government of the United States of America.
Carl, what do you think?
Can I add?
Go ahead.
I apologize. I didn't get a chance on the last question. While it asked about AI, I got to tell you something. I think this court is a bigger threat to the democratic process than I do think AI is. What the Supreme Court has done on the Voting Rights Act, on money in politics, et cetera, as somebody who started his career in national politics of raising money, I think they have made an abomination of the political system. So if you ask me, and I had to pick my number one, I think the courts and the series of decisions, and this goes back 20, 30 years, not just with this court and recently, has made an abomination about the influence of money and special interests in the political system.
Hugh? The ambassador is wrong. I just want to make sure everyone knows that. This is the best court we have had in my lifetime. I've been teaching con law for 30 years. They are back to the original intent. And once we got Justice Kennedy to retire and we were able to get the court out of redistricting, we've got some clean rules. Citizens United has correctly decided the First Amendment is absolute. And so I just want, I know we're in Northern California. I don't expect anything other than murmuring, but it is where they are doing their job. Unlike Congress, the United States Supreme Court is doing its job.
Yeah, if I could be supportive of Hugh on that point, I did not remember hearing liberals say that corporations that were contributing before Citizens United from their corporate treasuries in political campaigns was wrong if they were labor unions. Those labor unions are corporations, and they were contributing to political campaigns, not the voluntary contributions of their members, but their dues taken from their pocketbooks, put in the corporate treasuries, and that was the American election system. They were spending more in presidential elections than were the two candidates themselves. So, you know, I agree with, look, back to the point though. We really do face a situation where these campaigns have gotten out of control in large measure because they are, look, I helped create the largest super PAC on the Republican side, American Crossroads Senate Leadership Fund. Why? Because the unions were outspending us. But I learned two things. One is this was run the right way. We had an independent board that set the rules and oversaw the budget, set the compensation for the employees, insisted upon low prices, low commissions, and nobody who worked for the group got paid under the table. These things are run now by grifters, Democrat and Republicans, right, in which the object is to enrich the consultant and maybe help the candidate. The second thing, though, is I want strong parties. Rather than having the American Crossroads Senate Leadership Fund, I'd rather have the Republican Party. Rather than having the, vote veterans, I'd rather have the Democratic Party, because our system is based upon two, whether we like it or not. It's not in the Constitution. It organically grew, and it will remain thus two powerful political parties. And I would rather have those two parties be the people in charge of the campaigns than all of these sort of, specialized groups of consultants with their favorite donors who are willing to write checks to them because they enrich them. And one guy said, I got the place in Tahoe, and then I got the place in Florida, and I got the, I mean, it is shocking how much grift is going on.
Yeah. Let me raise, this is a question that really deals with the whole issue of governing. And I think, Ram and I, Tim to some extent, probably, because I often say I've seen Washington at its best and Washington at its worst. The good news is I saw Washington work where Democrats and Republicans were willing to sit down and work together and compromise and be able to get things done. And that's not happening now. The electoral system was originally designed for compromise, seeking leaders. However, elections seem to reward the most polarizing voices. Is this a design flaw or a flaw of the public? Interesting question.
Yeah, I think that it's almost a part of the system because the free speech piece, and you can say whatever you want. But I think to Carl's point about the money moving outside of the parties, which also assisted with governing. Because when you had close votes, you'd go to the leader, and the leader needed to, get with the program. Here's the compromise. We're going to move the ball down the field, get some things in there that you want. Now you can flip them the bird and say, well, I'll get funded from an outside group. I don't need you. And that to me is the real structural problem, not just the campaign piece, but the actual governing piece. And I think it's going to burn itself out at some point, because there's only so many times you can ask somebody for $5, $20, because you said something inflammatory on cable news. I think that will spin out. Will it be this year, next year, 2 years, post? I don't know. But I think it's exhausting, and I think people are at some point going to be turned off to that stuff.
Carl, what do you think? You got, I mean, it's obvious we have a dysfunctional Washington right now, that they're not able to get things done. You don't have leadership from the president. You don't have leadership really from the parties in the Congress. How do we get back to a time when the parties were able to work together and be able to find compromise and govern? I mean, in my day, when you passed something and it was bipartisan, there was a good feeling about getting something done for the country that both parties could be a part of. That doesn't happen. How do we get back to that?
Well, first of all, it does happen, but it doesn't happen because of the White House. Take, for example, the infrastructure bill, which came about as a result of Democrats and Republicans on the Senate Transportation Committee saying the House has written a really stupid reauthorization of the Highway Trust Fund that said no monies could be used to create any additional capacity on federal interstate highways. We're not going to wait around for that piece of crap. Why don't we go out of cycle and see if we can't write a bill to reauthorize the Highway Trust Fund as we do every 5 years? And what happened is they got it done. And so they said to themselves, well, that worked. We keep talking about infrastructure. Can we, Democrats and Republicans, agree on a certain amount and a process that takes the politics out of it? And they did. In fact, the Biden White House said, we don't want you to pass that bill because we don't want you to bring it up because it'll undermine support for Build Back Better. Same thing happened on the CHIPS bill. Freshman Republican senator from Indiana says the senior Democrat from Virginia seems to have the same concern I have about China, and if it takes Taiwan, what happens to our supply of computer chips? 90% of them come from Taiwan, and they got together and wrote a bill. So there's a sentiment there, but it requires presidential leadership. And, you know, with all due respect to President Obama, it was a mistake in February of 2009 to cut off Eric Cantor and the House Republicans who came down from the Hill to make recommendations for the stimulus bill and say, I won, cut them off. I learned a lesson. 2001, 9/11, the economy went into the tank. We lost 1 million jobs in 90 days. We're out in Chicago at a ceremony when United and American came back into the skies. Very emotional. Everybody at that ceremony of thousands of people knew somebody on one of those flights that went down on that day. And Bush sees Gephardt there. And he says, ask him if he wants to ride back to Washington. I go over to get the leader. Leader says, yeah, I'd love to fly back to Washington on Air Force One. President gets him in the office. He says, we got to have a stimulus bill. My guys have been working on it. The economy is in the tank. Number one thing, cut the corporate tax rate. Here are 3 or 4 other things. Gephardt says, Mr. President, can't get Democrat votes for cutting the corporate tax rate. I can get it for 100% expensing and immediate depreciation. We go back to the White House. The president calls up the head of the National Economic Council, Larry Lindsey, says, going to swap it out. Lindsey says, Mr. President, it won't be as strong, won't be as effective. Bush says, we're going to do it. Vote is held. A couple weeks later, we get it through the House. Big vote. Democrats and Republicans alike. I walk into the Oval. The president says, how'd it go? I said, Mr. President, good vote. And he said, great, congratulations. That's really good. I said, but Gephardt voted against it. Now, this may surprise you, but I can be a little bit of a hothead. So I said it a little bit more forcefully. And Bush says, what are you, an idiot? Are you a moron? He was never going to vote for it. I said, well, it was his idea to swap it out. He said, yeah, but he's the Democratic leader. He can't vote for it. He told us he couldn't get Democrat votes for it. We passed it with a lot of Democrat votes because he didn't, stop him. And he knows we're paying attention to him. That's an adult. And we need adult as the next president of the United States. We haven't had one for a while.
Can I add, because it's about Carl's boss, on the last Wednesday of his presidency, W invited a half dozen talk show hosts from our side of the aisle to come into the Oval, which you never say no to. He'd done it a couple of times. And the reason was, he said, this is a difficult job. I want you to give the new guy a chance, talking about President Obama. So W is telling Mark Levin and Hugh Hewitt and 4 other people, lay off President-elect Obama for a few months to let him do it. That is feeding into the Axelrod theory that you vote for a president who is unlike the president in personality who is currently in. if that is the case, we will get a detail-oriented, calm, Glenn Youngkin sort of appeal, and that will be good for everyone.
Maybe it won't be the greatest president like I have.
Let me,
Oh, wait,
The gold will be gone. They'll take the gold out. It won't be so goldish anymore.
Since Carl decided to do that, I just want to say I love Leon and Sylvia. I've always loved Monterey. You guys have some of the best Italian restaurants out there right now. Here's the deal. The fact is,
quickly.
Hillary's the most qualified person ever to run for president. More qualified than me.
I think Chicago's the greatest city I've ever seen.
Let me stop.
Wait, I know one thing, Leon. Look, you and I go back to Clinton and then Obama. I will say this about President Bush. My job was to beat the crap out of the Republicans in '06. He and I, the president, worked out, because the first bill I did was the Great Lakes Restoration Act. And President Bush, while I'm trying to beat the crap out of him and flip the House, which we did and made Nancy Speaker, he and I worked out the Great Lakes Restoration Act. That's what presidential leadership is about. You know politics, you know elections, and you know governing. And you got to know all of them. And sometimes they overlap, and sometimes they jam up the works, and sometimes they don't. President Bush, we worked it. He knew what I was going to do from 9 to 5, and I knew what he was going to do from 9 to 5. But that's an example, which is why, like an example, if I decide to do this, I've said, no bill I will sign that is partisan. It has to be bipartisan. And it will force the Congress to start to do something and start having conversations. And I'll give an example of this, not the bill I would write, but the Dignity Act on immigration has 23 hours in the House and 23 hours in the Democrats. It's true to being a nation of laws and a nation of immigrants. Now, I think we have spent enough time beating the hell out of each other for 40 years on this. Is it the bill I would write? It's not the bill I would write. But does it get the job done? It gets the job done. And if the President of the United States says, that's what we're going to do, you can make the system go back to functioning.
Okay, I've got to bring this to a close.
Why? We're just getting started.
We've considered a very important issue, which is our election system and the various challenges that you just heard of. The most important thing about our country and our democracy is we the people. And whether or not we have enough interest to participate in our democracy. By the fact that all of you are here, you want to participate in our democracy, and I thank you for your devotion, because I think the strength of this country lies in this audience. Thank you very much. We'll see you next year.